Joe shuffled down the street, his head hung low. The weight of his empty pockets mirrored the emptiness in his stomach. Weeks he'd been out of work, and each day brought a new wave of despair. He glanced up as a sleek car pulled up beside him. The man behind the wheel was Frank Miller, a name whispered in both admiration and fear. Joe knew him as a man of influence, a man who could make or break fortunes.
Joe, is that you?
Frank's voice boomed from the car. Joe straightened, surprised.
It's been a while. You're looking thin. Hard times?
Joe nodded, shame creeping up his throat. He wasn't one to beg. Yet here he was, hoping for a miracle.
Get in,
Frank commanded, his tone leaving no room for argument. Joe hesitated but obeyed. As he settled into the plush leather seat, a flicker of hope ignited in his chest. Maybe, just maybe, this was his lucky break. Frank spoke of business ventures, of opportunities, painting a picture of a world Joe could only dream of. And then, just as quickly, he shifted gears, his tone turning serious.
I've heard about your situation, Joe. I might have something for you, a job, a chance to get back on your feet.
Joe's heart leaped.
Mr. Miller, I wouldn't let you down. I'm a hard worker. I'll do anything.
Frank smiled, a slow, unsettling smile that sent a shiver down Joe's spine.
Anything, Joe?
Joe swallowed hard, a knot of unease twisting in his gut. Frank's words hung in the air, heavy with an implication he couldn't quite place.
Anything within reason, Mr. Miller.
He managed, his voice strained.
Of course, of course.
Frank chuckled, his eyes gleaming with a strange intensity. He leaned closer, the scent of his expensive cologne filling the confined space of the car.
Let's be frank, Joe. I admire your wife. Grace, is it? A beautiful woman.
Joe's blood ran cold. He knew Frank's reputation, the whispers about his escapades, the rumors about the price of his favors. Suddenly, the luxurious car felt like a cage, the air thick with unspoken threats.
Mr. Miller, I appreciate the offer, but my wife is not part of any deal.
Frank raised an eyebrow, his smile fading.
Now, Joe, don't be hasty. Think about what you're refusing. Think about Grace, about the life I can offer her, the life I can offer you both.
Joe felt a surge of anger, hot and blinding. He wanted to lash out, to tell Frank to go to hell. But the thought of Grace, of their meager existence, held him back. He was trapped, caught between his principles and his desperation.
I need some time to think.
Joe choked out, his voice hoarse with emotion. Frank studied him for a moment, his gaze cold and calculating. Then he nodded slowly.
Very well, Joe, but don't take too long. Opportunities like this don't come around often.
Joe stumbled out of the car, his legs feeling like jelly. The encounter had left him shaken, the weight of Frank's proposition crushing him. He walked for what felt like hours, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. The shame of it all gnawed at him. How could he even consider such a thing? Grace was the love of his life, his everything. To even entertain the thought of offering her to Frank in exchange for his own salvation felt like a betrayal of the deepest kind. He reached their small apartment, the paint peeling, the furniture worn with time. Grace greeted him with a tired smile, her eyes reflecting the strain of their situation. He forced a smile back, his heart aching at the thought of the burden she carried.
Any luck with the job hunting?
She asked, her voice laced with hope. Joe hesitated, the weight of Frank's words suffocating him. He couldn't bring himself to tell her, to see the look on her face when she learned the true cost of Frank's offer.
Nothing concrete yet, but I haven't given up.
Grace reached out, her hand gently touching his arm.
Don't worry, Joe. We'll get through this together.
Her words, filled with such unwavering love and support, tore at Joe's already frayed conscience. He pulled her close, burying his face in her hair, the scent of her familiar and comforting. He wouldn't let her down. But as he held her, the image of Frank's smug face, his words echoing in his ears, filled him with a cold dread. Days turned into nights. each hour an agonizing reminder of Joe's predicament. He couldn't escape the suffocating presence of Frank's proposition. It hung over him like a dark cloud, poisoning his every thought.
The bills piled up, the threat of eviction looming over our heads.
He found himself snapping at Grace, his frustration and guilt spilling over. He withdrew into himself, the burden of his secret too heavy to bear alone.
I tried to find work, pounding the pavement, taking on odd jobs that barely paid enough to keep us afloat. But it wasn't enough.
Joe watched Grace, her once vibrant spirit slowly fading under the weight of their situation. He saw the worry etched on her face, the way she tried to hide her exhaustion behind a forced smile.
The thought of Frank's offer, once repulsive, now whispered a dangerous temptation. I tried to resist it, to cling to my principles, but the line between right and wrong blurred with each passing day.
He couldn't bear to see the look in her eyes, to watch the light within her dim, so he did the only thing he could think of. He lied.
Joe, what's wrong? You're not yourself. Please talk to me.
He looked at her, at the woman he loved more than life itself, and his heart shattered. He wanted to tell her everything, to confess his weakness, to beg for her forgiveness.
There's a promising job lead, a glimmer of hope on the horizon.
And as he watched relief wash over her face, he hated himself a little bit more. Grace saw the change in Joe. He was distant, his eyes clouded with a worry he couldn't hide. He spoke of a job, of a potential breakthrough, but his words lacked conviction. She knew him too well, could read the truth etched on his weary face. One day, while Joe was out, a sleek car pulled up outside their building. Frank Miller stepped out, his gaze fixed on their apartment door. He looked different, his usual arrogance replaced with a strange urgency. He knocked, and Grace's heart skipped a beat. She had seen him with Joe, knew who he was, the power he held. A sense of dread washed over her, a premonition of something terrible about to unfold.
Mrs. Grace, may I come in?
She hesitated but stepped aside, her mind racing. What could he possibly want with her? Frank wasted no time with pleasantries. He spoke of Joe, of his struggles, of a job offer, a way out of their predicament. But his words were laced with a veiled threat, a hint of something sinister lurking beneath the surface.
He refused my offer. He's a fool, Grace. He doesn't understand what's at stake. But you're different. You understand the realities of life.
Grace listened, her blood turning to ice. She understood, all too well. Frank wasn't offering a job, he was offering a lifeline, a way out of their despair. But the price he demanded, the price of her dignity, of her love for Joe, was one she couldn't bear to pay. Yet, as she looked at the desperation in Frank's eyes, a terrifying thought took root in her mind. What if she was their only hope? What if her sacrifice, as abhorrent as it seemed, was the only way to save Joe, to save them both?
You didn't have to do this, Grace, but I'm glad you did. The plush carpet felt strange beneath Grace's worn shoes. The air in the luxurious hotel room was thick with the scent of lilies, suffocating in its opulence. Frank poured her a drink, his movements deliberate, his gaze never leaving her.
It's for Joe. She took a sip of the amber liquid, its bitterness mirroring the taste in her mouth.
Of course, it's always for the ones we love, isn't it? Frank chuckled, a humorless sound that sent a shiver down her spine. Stay here. He moved closer, his hand reaching out to caress her cheek. Grace flinched, but she didn't move away. She had made her choice, a choice born of desperation and a love so profound it bordered on madness. She closed her eyes, willing herself to be numb, to shut out the shame that threatened to consume her. Time lost all meaning. Minutes stretched into an eternity, each tick of the clock a hammer blow to her soul. She felt Frank's presence beside her, his touch a violation she couldn't escape. A single tear escaped, tracing a path down her cheek. Suddenly there was a commotion outside, raised voices, a pounding on the door. Frank froze, his eyes widening in surprise.
His voice was laced with a threat she had never heard before. He strode towards the door, his hand reaching for the knob. Grace sat there, paralyzed by fear and a strange sense of relief. The interruption, whatever it was, had broken the spell. She was free, at least for now. But as she heard the muffled voices outside, a new wave of dread washed over her. What had she done?